now. So we're recording now. So without any further ado, I shall hand over to Mike. And Mike, I will make you host again so that you can then share your screen. Over to you.
Lovely. Thanks a lot, Phil. Yeah, I say a big thank you to Phil for doing the techie bits and getting all that sort of thing sorted out, because it would have been a pain otherwise. And I really am grateful to him. Right, I presume, can everybody see my screen all right? Yeah, great stuff. Right, slowing the flow, or STF, and natural flood management. And of course, there's beavers thrown in as well. I'm Mike Potter from Pickering. I suppose I better go on. That's me on one of the pictures there at one of the, it's called a mini bund, but it's not exactly mini, up in Cropton Forest in North Yorkshire. Oh, how do I get that to move to the next one?
If you click on your right key, the right arrow key on your keyboard, it should go on.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing, but for some reason it's not moving on. It was working before. Hang on a minute.
If you click on the arrow at the bottom of the screen, does it work?
Ah, yeah, that's working. Right. Right, the first thing I always say to people is that I'm not really an expert. I don't have any qualifications in flooding and all that sort of stuff. So all I've got at the moment is 14 years of practical experience. So you don't have to believe anything I say, but the 14 years does tend to help. I'm really just some Mr. Nobody from Pickering who happened to get involved in all this flood stuff back in the olden days, before you ever heard about natural flood management and upland management and things like that, and NFM on the radio, before it suddenly got to be quite popular and well accepted. And so lots of politicians and top civil servants suddenly reinvented it. But when we started in Pickering, it was unproven. There was no evidence that it worked. So everybody tried to avoid it, other than a handful of very dedicated sort of people. So I'm going to read this out as it is, because we will never stop all floods, particularly with the way that climate change is going. But there have always been massive floods, and you really can't protect against the really big ones. So unfortunately, man-made climate change is making them more frequent and more intense. And on the opposite side of that, there are more droughts too, which is easily forgotten, but it's just as damaging and important. The basics of that is, as the climate is warming, and of course the climate is not the same as weather, the climate is the sum total of all the weather. And because we are heating the globe with what we're doing, with more heat in the system that can't escape, that is energy that's not escaping. That energy has to go somewhere, and sadly that is what ends up creating more rainfall, stronger winds, all the really damaging stuff. And I'm sure all the sort of people who are here, I'm sure we haven't got any climate change deniers. If we have, there might be an interesting debate at the end. But Mother Nature is massively more powerful than we are. So the top priority for all of us is to stop making climate change worse. And yeah, with 20 or so people here tonight, what difference can we make? Well, we can, because if we can convince 1 million, 10 million, 20 million, a billion people to make some small changes, that is a massive difference. And it's far better to get a lot of people making little changes without being perfect than a handful, say 20 people, being absolutely squeaky clean and never driving anywhere. So after all that, all we can do is hope to limit the damage from the manageable flood events, the smaller flood events. Once we get to the 1 in 100s and above, there's not an awful lot we can do because Mother Nature really is that much more powerful. Oh, the key's working now. Never mind, kicked it into action. Right, we're going to have a question and answer session at the end, but I like to ask these questions. I've been doing it for quite a few years now, and these are just for you to ponder over yourself. Can we afford hard flood defences, as in concrete stuff, flood walls, to defend every vulnerable community against flood events? If you think back to, let's say, 2007 or 2015 Boxing Day, there were massive flood events across the north of England. In 2007, it was more widespread. And it affected virtually every town, village, hamlet. And it wasn't just water sitting in the bottom of the valleys, it was water running down the hillsides. And so many people were affected. But can we afford to put hard defences in to defend all of them? I think the answer quite clearly is no. So if it's unaffordable, do we just abandon all those people and communities to frequent flooding? Well, I'd rather hope not, but we initially had a problem, this is why we got involved in Pickering, with some frequent flooding, and then finding that the Environment Agency worked very much on a cost-benefit analysis. So whatever the cost is, you compare it to the benefits, as in how many houses and businesses, and that's the balance. And unfortunately, fortunately, if you're in an urban area, the balance usually works because there are so many houses and people and businesses that are protected. If you're anywhere else, not a chance. Will dredging every river solve our flood problems? This is a thorny issue, and it's one that you will have heard, from numerous people saying, just dredge every river, that'll solve the problem. Well, the answer actually is no, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail later. So, do we continue to treat the symptoms where flooding occurs, or do we try and address the causes? And of course, if you put flood walls, that's treating the symptoms, because all it does is protect the immediate vicinity. Hence why I'm saying our first priority is to try and deal with climate change, which is one of the biggest problems. We'll still get flooding anyway, but why does this water suddenly come more quickly and do more damage? And do we need a fresh approach that looks at the whole catchment? Well, I believe we do, because it's rather a more helpful approach than just looking at specific places. Now, I like to differentiate, and I think it's useful for everybody to try and differentiate between speeding the flow and slowing the flow. When we set up the scheme in Pickering, somebody, I think it was somebody from Forestry Commission or Forest Research, who came up with the name Slowing the Flow. And it's a fabulous name because it does exactly what it says. I would say on the tin, but I can't say that. So you're either trying to slow the flow of the water or speed the flow of the water. Sometimes it's you need to do one or both, but it depends what you're doing where. But this is the bad stuff. And the basis of it is reducing hydraulic roughness. Now that sounds slightly technical, but it's not. Hydraulic means water. And the roughness is how rough it is. So how does it oppose the flow of water? One of the first things I learned when I started looking or trying to learn more about flooding and its impacts, because I don't know if I'm allowed to say this in front of a refined audience, but I can't stand bullshitters. And I thought, if I'm going to, well, oh yeah, I've obviously, there's youngsters listening, so I can't use language like that. I can't be dealing with people who just give you the blarney and they don't really know what they're talking about. So the first thing I tried to do when I got involved was learn from the experts, and I'm still learning now, and I do try and keep an open mind. So one of the first things I learned, which wasn't exactly highbrow, is in the Yorkshire parlance, water always flows downhill. And it's so simple, but it is so true. But not only does water always flow downhill, unless you're pumping it uphill, it also will always find the path of least resistance. So if you've got a hard path or a sort of tarmac path or anything like that, it'll run down there far more easily. And if you've got a steep gradient, the steeper gradient, the more easily it'll run down there. And hydraulic roughness is simply putting stuff onto that surface that slows the flow of the water, and slowing the flow. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. Again, speeding the flow, dredging from source to sea. Now, in reality, this speeds the flow, but unfortunately, what's the next thing down the river or the beck, stream or whatever? There's invariably another town, another village, a bridge, a culvert, some sort of constriction in the water. And if you move that water faster in that direction, then it'll get to whatever constriction and it'll start flowing out, hence flooding. Deforestation and removing hedges. Just an interesting little figure that I only heard this week. We, and I say that in inverted commas, are destroying the equivalent of 30 football pitches every minute from the forests in South America. And I was taught as a kid that that's the lungs of the world. 30 football pitches every minute, every day, every week. It's quite frightening. And if those are the lungs of the world, I think we as humanity are smoking 60 a day and giving ourselves lung cancer. But anyway, if you remove trees and you remove hedges, you're removing that hydraulic roughness and the sort of barriers to water, so that speeds the flow. Having bare ground, so that really depends on crop types or certain weeds. If you've got Himalayan balsam, which I'm sure most of you'll know, if you've got that on, it invariably grows on riverbanks. Now, unfortunately, it is very invasive, so it'll take over a whole area, but then in the winter, it dies back to a slimy mess and leaves bare ground. And that, the water can rush across that far more easily. In addition to that, it doesn't bind the banks together like sort of good grass and tussocky grass and what have you. So then you've got a lot of erosion, and that actually puts into the river the sort of stuff that people say, oh, we should be dredging that out. But those sort of people, you never hear them. Sorry, I'm trying to fight the cat off walking across my keyboard. Yeah, you don't hear people talking about addressing the sediment supply. Where does all that stuff in the rivers come from? Well, you know, if we address the sediment supply in the first place, we wouldn't need to do as much dredging anyway. Crop types, yeah, if you see sweet corn, what was it called, maize, and oilseed rape, those tend to leave very much bare ground in the winter, so water runs more easily across that. Soil compaction is another big problem. If you've got overgrazing, so you've got a lot of stock on the land, or much heavier machinery, invariably tractors are massive nowadays and much heavier, so that will compact the soil. So consequently, water runs over that sort of hard ground far more easily, depending on the type of soil, largely. With moorland, I'm thinking, I mean, obviously I live on the edge of the North York Moors, but there was a time when drainage channels were cut into the moorland to drain it, because, hang on a minute, I'm just going to shut the door, I can hear my missus in the background. Sorry about that. So yes, if you've got these drainage channels in soft peat and you get a heavy rainfall, it soon scours out that peat because it's quite soft stuff. That's yet more sediment into the rivers, but it's also running off far more quickly and drying the moorland, which is damaging in terms of both flood risk, because you've got the faster runoff, but in times of drought, the more water you can retain on the moorland, the more sphagnum you've got soaking that water up. The longer you can keep it wet, the more it's resilient to drought. That really is an important one, because sphagnum is the key to keeping the moorlands in good condition and acting like a massive sponge. And of course, carbon sequestration, loss of carbon, that's really important in terms of climate change. Even dodgy ploughing, you'll often see farmers who will plough up and down a slope. Well, all you're doing there is creating a whole series of lovely drainage channels that quickly move everything of the water down to the bottom of the field. Not only that, it moves a lot of his soil down to the bottom of the field as well. And I was under the impression that the soil was one of the, if not the most important resource of a farmer. So just ploughing across a slope makes a big difference, because that creates a barrier to water running down. And obviously an increase in impermeable surfaces, which means buildings, roads, paving, tarmac, concrete, that has a hydraulic roughness of virtually zero, and water will very nicely run off that and doesn't soak into the ground. So those are bad bits. Now, if I move on to slowing the flow, and I'll start off by pointing out a couple of the pictures. These are just small woody debris dams, or leaky dams. Very, very simple, up in the top of the catchment in the areas of forestry where it's been clear felled. And you can see how the water will pond behind it in high flow conditions, but then it drains out in lower flow conditions, or sort of fairly normal conditions. So when you get heavy rainfall, the water backs up behind it, hence slowing the flow. And without hopefully getting too technical, if you think, usually I have a graph on here, but I haven't got it on this time. A hydrograph, again, it sounds a bit technical, but hydro meaning water, and a graph, I think everybody can remember back to the school days what a graph is. So a graph of the water. So if you think of the amount of water up the x-axis, up the side, and time along the y-axis, if you've got heavy rainfall, suddenly that curve goes up and up because you've got a lot of water, and then it peaks as the rain gets to a peak, and then it drops off again. But if you've got the water coming very quickly, it squashes that curve into a very steep curve, or a peak. And it's the bit at the very top of the peak that causes the flooding. So if instead of a big, sharp, pointy peak, if you can flatten it out, you've got the same area, so the same amount of water under the curve. But if you can cut off the peak of the hydrograph, that's the bit that does the flooding. So all you're doing is making the same amount of water flow, but in a longer period of time. So that can cut out some of the flooding in the lower events. So the more you can slow the flow by storing it temporarily upstream, the more you try and stop the low level floods. And we've got to admit that natural flood management is about a lot of small measures. To use a cycling terminology, it's the aggregation of marginal gains. Sounds a bit complex, but it's just the cumulative effect of lots of little things but lots of little cheap, easy to build things. So you can still have effective drainage of land, which is what a lot of people want, farmers and landowners. But if you slow the flow through natural flood management, it's about working with nature, not against it. And it'll come as no surprise to find that this is the way that nature does it naturally when man doesn't mess about and sort of tidies up all the rivers and chops the trees down and all that sort of thing. So these are the different methods. The leaky dams that I've already explained, WDD, that's woody debris dams. So just dams built out of timber. You can build them out of whatever's there. You can build them out of stone and things, as long as it's leaking, so the water empties out under low flow conditions. And working with natural processes, we've got an engineered bund above Pickering. It's exactly the same process. It is just a leaky dam, but it's engineered. It's made out of concrete and a clay wall. So you can't really call it natural flood management, but it's using exactly the same processes. Reforestation and hedge planting, obviously exactly the opposite of what I was saying about speeding the flow. It's so important to plant trees and hedges that create a physical barrier to water and also take a lot of water down into the ground so that it's not just running off. And that has benefits in drought terms as well. And obviously climate change, because you're storing the carbon. Maul and drain blocking. What you can do is just literally block the drains. Normally you use bales of heather or similar sort of thing, or you can use things like woody debris dams or sort of wooden structures just to block it, but still allow the water to drain through by having a hole in it somewhere. Peat restoration, that's mainly about getting the surface on where it's badly eroded. Across the Pennines, I'm sure you'll have seen where you've got bare peat and you really want to get that covered up, but the sphagnum moss is a really important stuff to try and get that. Attenuation ponds, that's simply having a pond, either digging a pond, using an existing dam that's no longer used, but use the same principles of you have a drain of a limited size so that in low flow conditions or low rainfall conditions, it just empties out through this hole. You don't need sluice gates or anything. It just empties through the hole. But as soon as you get the high flows, the heavy rainfall, it starts to fill because the culvert or the hole can't cope with the whole amount of water. And then as soon as the rain, so it fills and fills. If you fill the whole of your storage, as in you fill a reservoir or a pond to the top, it'll just overtop. So you haven't got any more storage, so it'll flood out. But the hope is that in the lower flood, lower sort of type of floods, it's quite effective. It doesn't work for the massive floods because you fill up all your storage. SUDS, that's sustainable drainage systems. And really that can be rural or urban. So in the towns, we should have far more SUDS than we do. You can have just little berms and rills where it's just hollows that hold the water temporarily so that it doesn't drain away quickly, and green roofs on buildings and all that sort of thing, all slowing the flow. Catchment sensitive farming, that goes along with buffer strips. That's about doing the right sort of ploughing, looking after your soils. So not only are they better quality soils, but you don't get the fast runoff because they're not compacted. Put buffer strips alongside rivers with using tussocky grass, trees, shrubs, or whatever. That means the water doesn't run off the land quickly into the rivers, but it also holds back the soil, stops that running in, and all the nutrients and fertilizers that farmers put on at great expense. So they don't want to lose that into the river, but that also has a massive detrimental effect in the river because it's polluting the river, but it's promoting weed growth, which is another problem. River re-meandering and braiding. So many of the rivers that we have now, particularly in the flatlands, aren't really rivers. They're more like canals because they've been re-engineered, rerouted. Now, if you think of a river meandering across flat land, so it's sort of wiggling, and then you straighten it. So from point A to point B, you've probably halved the distance because the straight line distance, instead of that wiggle, is about half the distance. And yet you've got the same gradient from A to B. So not only have you straightened it so the water can flow faster, because you've increased the gradient of it, it has more force. So you get a lot more scour, so sort of taking the bankings away. So if you can actually re-meander a lot of the rivers, and braiding just means multiple channels. And that's how rivers naturally would have braided themselves if left to their own devices. Addressing the sediment supply, I've already said about that one. And we can stop just cleaning out rivers. Now, it's horses for courses, because if you're in the town and the river's running through the town, you actually do want to clear the river so that you haven't got anything that's creating a barrier and forcing the water out. So clear the trees, dredge the rivers, get rid of the vegetation, get the water through the town as quickly as possible. But above the town and below the town, that's where you want to slow the flow. So it's horses for courses, doing the right things in the right places. So the essentials, as I just said, put the right things in the right places, taking a whole catchment approach. Now, the picture on the right there is the bond in Pickering. So it's just about a mile above the town, and it is literally just a concrete wall and a bond, or just a dam wall, across from one side of the valley to the other. It's got a specially constructed culvert. Well, not specially constructed, it's just to a specific size. So in normal conditions, the beck just flows through quite happily. When it gets to the point where just the amount of water that would flood the town, it gets to the point where it can't get through that culvert anymore. So it starts to back up behind there. But all it's flooding is an area upstream. It's just a piece of pasture, and it's got 120,000 cubic meter capacity. So that's an awful lot of water that can store, flooding a piece of pasture upstream rather than flooding the town itself. If it ever got to the point where we had a massive flood and all the storage was gradually filled, it would just spill over the top of the bund, and it would still flood the town, but at least we'd know exactly what time that water was coming down. So you can sort of try and move all your furniture and all the rest of it. But far better to have one really bad flood. But in actual fact, I think we're up to about 27 times since it was finished in 2015. It's actually filled, it started to fill about 27 times. They wouldn't have been major floods, but at least one of them certainly would have been. So taking the whole catchment approach, if you look at the uplands, so the upper catchment, that's where you want to try and put your natural flood management, so you're slowing the flow, and upstream storage like the bond in Pickering. and actually flood the floodplain as the river intended. So get the water out onto the floodplain, because it actually is part of the river. It might sound a bit odd, but the floodplain is part of the river, which is why it's not always a good idea to be building on there, but we still do. River maintenance, so there are times when it's right to dredge and clear the vegetation and speed the flow, but invariably through the towns and villages. And hard defences do have their place sometimes, flood walls. Now, who maintains all this natural flood management and who pays for it? Well, unfortunately, we haven't got any national policy from government on this, apart from whoever builds it has to inspect it, maintain it, and replace it. So if that happens to be community groups, non-governmental organisations, but even government agencies like the Forestry Commission, if they're not given specific cash and resources to inspect it, maintain it, and replace it, where does it come from? And it is a big problem. What about beavers? Now, the picture on the right there is just above us in Cropton Forest, and that is a massive and rather expensive enclosure, which is called the political fence by the Forestry Commission, because it's one of those things that they had to do to release the beavers until it's sort of proven that they can be managed successfully. Now, I was actually given this part of the presentation by one of the guys from the Forestry Commission, and I hadn't actually seen his presentation, so I had to interpret it myself. But once I'd done that, I was absolutely blown away, because if you look at the bit where it says 2011 in the top left, there is a single watercourse with a pond. Ignore that line coming off to the side, but a single watercourse and a pond, and that is when the beavers were released. And then you see in 2012 the effect that they'd had, because that same watercourse had turned into a series of dams, ponds, small tributaries. And then look at it in 2013, and finally look how it was in 2016, a mere 5 years later. And look at that absolutely complex network of dams, small streams, tributaries, dams. And that is a mere 183 metres in length. That's about 200 yards for those in old money. And in a mere 5 years, that is absolutely astounding. The beavers are such fantastic hydraulic engineers. And all they're really doing is producing their own ideal environment, but it is so fabulous for exactly our purposes. Now, again, these beavers in Devon, and the picture there, they are actually nocturnal beavers, so they're not easy to spot. And look at the size of the tree that thing's felling. Apparently, they very, very rarely drop a tree on themselves. There is the odd occasion where they get trapped by branches, but not very often. So they're brighter than most foresters. Yeah, they're not stupid. So in only 183 metres of watercourse, covering 1.8 hectares, these beavers constructed 13 dams, holding up to 1,000 cubic metres of additional water within those ponds on the site. During storm events, on average, the peak flows were 30% lower leaving the site than entering than it was previously. So you've got the flow has been slowed by 30%, or the actual peak of it, the sort of highest amount. And the lag time between what was flowing into the site and leaving the site, literally 200 yards further down, was on average an hour less. So they'd slowed the flow by an hour. So just imagine that on a much bigger scale. It's just quite astounding. Now, the beavers in Cropton Forest, and I'll just go through those pictures. it looks a bit unexceptional, that a few bits of twig poking out of the water. But that is, if a lot of you will have heard of the term pollarding, which is where you cut the trees back quite severely so it grows again from the roots. So the roots are all intact, but you can see where the beavers have pollarded these. They've felled, I think most of that is, oh blimey, I forgot the word, never mind. They've dropped that in the water, but interestingly, if you look, if you've ever seen somebody laying a hedge, and it's called pleachers, where you cut through the branches, but not fully, so they're still alive. So they've actually pleached those stems. Willow, that was the technical word I was looking for. Terrible old age, isn't it? So that tree, or is more of a sapling really, is still alive, and that will start to regrow, and that's providing the food for them, because beavers actually eat the bark and some of the leaves and twigs, but they're herbivores, they don't eat fish. So they're maintaining their food supply. So not only are they using the timber to build the dams, but they're making sure that their food supply is still there. And the fantastic thing is that that is opening up the tree canopy. So it's improving a lot the ecosystem for the wildlife. You've got an aquatic environment, so it's storing more water, so the amphibians, the frogs, the toads and what have you, they love it. All sorts of other animals comes in. There's all sorts of flora and fauna that grows because you've opened up the tree canopy. And yet at the same time, it's doing this wonderful flood mitigation of storing more water. It cleans the water because it's going through all sorts of dams. So it's just a sort of win-win situation, as long as it's not, as long as the beavers don't end up in conflict with landowners because they're flooding areas of land that's actually productive farmland. That's the only real drawback. And the picture to the bottom right, for which many thanks for Richard Burden for his fantastic photography, that is the amazing Beaver Dam. Now, just imagine, that's about 6 or 7 foot high. Just imagine the water behind that. And the fact that they've built that structure and it's holding back all that water is just amazing. So there were 2 beavers released in April 2019 inside that big enclosure, and it is a big enclosure. There were 2 kits or babies very quickly, so the female was obviously pregnant. There's 2 more this year, so there are 6 of them. And so they've felled and coppiced most of those waterside trees, opening it all up to the light, greatly improving the biodiversity. They've repaired 2 existing ponds that were pretty much just a sort of wet, boggy mess, and raised the water levels by 1 metre in each. And that 6 foot high dam right across the floodplain. And that is to protect their lodge, which is their house. So it protects it from predators, and it has an underwater entrance. So they actually, where they live in the lodge is actually above the water line, but it's protected. So how do we do all this stuff? Well, just again, there's another picture of the Beaver Dam, and you can see the water in front of it. The whole of the valley bottom in front of this dam is just absolutely saturated with water running across it. And you can see the size of the trees that they've felled and just dropped them into the water. Now, they might use that in future, but it's obviously serving a purpose. But going back to this natural flood management, how do we do it? Well, it helps to have a sound knowledge in the first place so that you know what you're doing, why you're doing it. It's easy to say communication is important, but even politicians communicate, but a lot of it's not particularly effective. That's the key, effective communications. And you've got to build relationships and trust with the people that you're working with. Well, that's not just in the flood world, that works across just about everything. Work with people with a can-do attitude, because they will always find a way of doing something. Whereas the people with the can't-do attitude, if you say, well, can you do such and such, you say, oh no, we couldn't possibly do that. Solve that problem, and they'll just find another one. But focus on delivery, because as I've often said, you can produce as many reports and consultations and plans about how you solve flooding, as many as you like, but it doesn't protect a single person from flooding until you deliver by actually building things like debris dams, getting an even engineered bund built, not easy, or releasing the dams. Right, I think that's plenty for the time being. So should I hand back? Hang on a minute.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Mike.
I rabbited on for longer than I should have done, as usual.
Oh, that's good.
Right. Now then, I'll just...
Just stop
Oh.
sharing screen.
Yeah. Yeah, I was busy trying to find that. Right.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So yeah, we've got some questions in the chat box already, and I'm guessing that other people may have questions they want to ask. So if you have questions in the chat box, great. If you have questions you want to ask, please either flap your arms around a bit or just pop a question in the chat box. So
right, I'll whiz down that the first one. Right, do farmers really not appreciate the impact of ploughing up and down the gradient? I think a lot of them will, but unfortunately there are a few that won't. And if we go on to even more serious stuff about really knowing how to look after your soils and trying to get around that compaction, a lot of I'm not a farmer, so I can't really say too much, but a lot of farmers and so on will say, oh, this is what we've been doing for generations. But you'll probably find it's only 2 or 3 generations in about the last 100 years. And it involves all those massive inputs of non-natural fertilizers and so on. And the sort of thing that we've been doing because we can, and it massively increases production. But then we've got to balance that against the fact that we're completely denuding the soils and what have you, and even the way that we're managing water courses and so on. And a lot of landowners are actually doing that, and internal drainage boards. But we're now finding what we've been doing wrong. So we've got to the point where we've got to try and re-educate some people into how they should be doing things. But it's this balance where some people will say, oh, but we've got to have the food production. Yes, we have, but we can't destroy what we've got. It's got to be done sustainably. And sustainable is a wonderful word that nobody or very few people try to actually explain what it means. And to my mind, sustainable means you've got to keep doing it, be able to keep doing it. Now then, what else have we got? How do you reduce the negative impact that slowing the flow will have on fish migration? In the case of woody debris dams, they started off being built right out of the river, but they improved them by putting the bottom bar of the debris dams, keeping that above the level of the low flow. So there's nothing to stop fish or anything actually swimming under the dam. So it's only actually having an effect in high flow conditions. So saying, there are very few fish right up in the top of the catchment anyway. That the sort of negative impact of fish migration is more about the hard defences. If you put a dam into a river or a weir, and that's sort of old stuff from years ago where they didn't take that into account. Re-meandering rivers mean the river would need more space to expand. Would it mean creating more floodplains? Well, we don't create the floodplains. The river created the floodplains over centuries or millennia. But effectively, you've got the same amount of water flowing down the river. It's just running down a braided course, and it's actually got more river space to flow down. So it just means it flows more slowly down there.
It's the point with floodplains, Mike, that we need to stop building buildings on them and start thinking of them as a useful tool rather than something we have to somehow stop getting wet.
That's absolutely. I mean, there's always going to be a danger of building in floodplains. And in the case of Pickering Beck, because it had been variously straightened and altered over the years, and consequently it runs faster and with a stronger flow, it actually became very deeply incised. So it cut further down and down, which meant that even in high flows, it rarely got out of the beck into the floodplain because the actual river channel was so deep. And that means you lose all that potential storage. All the water in high flow conditions is shooting quickly down the river and not just spilling out onto the floodplain and temporarily storing itself there. Right, let's see how many beavers are there? Well, I've covered that because there are now 6. There are quite a lot of beavers being released in various places around the country. There are a lot in Scotland. That's where most of them come from, the sort of additional ones. How are they going to cope when they start procreating too much? Because they will happily live in an area, and they're very territorial because, as you can see, there's a massive amount of work actually goes into creating their territory, which is just creating their perfect environment. And once the family gets too big, a couple of the older ones will toddle off and find a new area. Well, that's all right if you've got enough area to do that in. And in the North York Moors where we are, there's plenty of space to expand, as long as they don't expand downstream and start coming into conflict with farmers and so on. So there's got to be a proper management structure around these beavers, and that's hopefully what DEFRA are trying to do. But as I've said before, I suspect the weak link of managing beavers will not be the beavers, it'll be man. It's like planting trees, planting willows on riverbanks. They were done for a reason, but then if you stop looking after them, they get so overgrown, they act like an upturned yard brush. What have we got? Would beavers be suitable for the Esk? They're not going to, you're not going to get beavers into really big rivers because they can't, they're obviously unable to build dams across massive rivers. But certainly the uplands, yes, they would be. Anywhere where you've got good wooded area, which is pretty much wilderness, they'll be happy with. As long as there are trees there, they will make the perfect environment. So invariably, you're talking about the sort of the wilder uplands, not on the top of the moors, but in the valleys and so on. Right. Well, that's more of a comment from John Joe. It sounds like we might have somewhere perfect for beavers. Right. Can Mike see where there might be other good beaver sites on other rivers above York, e.g. Ouse tributaries? Well, I can guarantee that, I mean, the main tributaries of York, the Swale, the Ure, the Nid, and the Ouse, and I can guarantee if you get far enough up those tributaries into the uplands, same as I just said before, as long as you've got good wooded areas where you're not going to get too much conflict with farmers and landowners, then the beavers will be quite happily make that their home. Hydroelectric power installed in Russup Weir, closely monitor fishermen not be harmed. Yes, that's interesting. Yeah, I've been up there a couple of times to see the hydroelectric scheme at Russup, and they had to do a very expensive consultation to make sure that the fish could actually swim up or get washed down their turbine. Yeah, it was a Archimedes screw turbine, and they could go up and down there without being damaged at all, the fish. And it was a really expensive piece of work. But once it had been done, that meant that those sort of hydro turbines could be put in anywhere, and the science had already been proven. And they did actually improve the way that there was a decent fish pass put into the weir, which meant the fish could get upstream far more easily. Yeah. Without a natural predator, will beavers need to be artificially managed or culled? Yes, there is a possibility of that. I mean, they do have natural predators. They're pretty big beasties, and they've got very strong jaws, obviously, if they can fell a tree. So, but I think maybe foxes would probably give them a good go, especially the younger ones. But yes, there is a possibility that they would actually have to be culled. But let's not get too squeamish about this. Let's make sure that these things are properly managed. Yes, it would be better to trap them and move them elsewhere, but they're actually very intelligent creatures. They're very sensitive to sound and noise and vibration. So they're very difficult to trap. And if you wanted to trap them to get rid of them completely, you'd have to trap the whole family, which is even more difficult. And this is the problem they have with them in the United States, where they sort of colonize big wilderness areas, but then they get into conflict, build dams in the wrong place. People try and demolish the dams, blow them up with gel ignite or whatever. The beavers just pop out again the next night, and they'll have it all fixed again in no time. There are ways of conning the beavers, because what you don't want is dams that don't leak enough, because that way you've not got enough water storage for the high flow conditions. So sometimes you might want to lower the level of the dams so they're not creating damage to properties or land. But as soon as a beaver hears running water, as in too much running water, it'll say, aye, I need to fix something here, and it'll just fix it. So what you've got to do is effectively put a penstock in, which means a pipe, so the water runs down it, but it comes out far enough away from the dam so that the beaver isn't saying, oh, I can hear too much running water, I'm going to fix that. And so it sort of cons the beavers, but there are ways of doing that. Right, we're getting near to time, but has anybody got a question that they haven't typed in?
Anybody want to ask anything? If so, just unmute yourself. No.
Cool, silence.
I think
I
we're
have
there.
to say, I could keep rabbiting on till about midnight, because every single aspect of this, I could talk in far more detail, and I quite often do, which is why I'm not allowed to talk about this stuff with my wife.
Oh well, it's this evening has been a good run for you then, hasn't it?
Yeah. So I mean, I'd really like to thank Phil again. Thanks to York Environment Week for allowing us to put this on. And as I said, I'm only an individual, so if you want to get involved, there are things like revitalising this area, the Yorkshire Derwent Partnership, there are the wildlife trusts. You can get involved in all sorts of things like that, but I'm just some guy who managed to force. Well, the Forestry Commission were fabulous. They wanted to do stuff, but The Environment Agency took a bit more convincing, because we had that funny catch-22 situation of them saying, well, we're not going to do all this natural flood management stuff because there's no evidence that it works. And then you said, but how do we get the evidence? Because you won't give us the money to do it. And we went round and round in circles for a long time, but eventually we got there. And all of a sudden, hey presto, every time you get a flood now, you hear somebody on the radio saying, blah, blah, slowing the flow, blah, blah, upland management. And I think, yeah, that's my job pretty much done.
That's excellent. Many thanks, Mike, and many thanks everybody for coming along tonight. York Environment Week has one final event tomorrow evening, which is about the York Greenways. So if you're interested in that, please do sign up. There's still time to do that. Otherwise, many thanks. There'll be some kind of follow-up email from either myself or Mike, just to make sure you've got contact details to keep in touch if you want to, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, everybody, for turning up and listening.